know Rabbi Kotok, and we are so delighted that he agreed to come back this year again and do a different series for us. So thank you for that, Rabbi.
My pleasure.
Just to remind you that Rabbi is a theology professor at a Roman Catholic school at
Seminary.
I'm sorry.
The seminary for all of Florida, Raleigh, Savannah, and Atlanta. So we have 175 men studying in graduate school to become priests. And we also have a Master of Divinity program for people who are female, if they want to be part of that group. Hey.
You let everybody in.
I'm not in the admissions committee.
Anyway, welcome back.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, Reverend Nate. Thank you so much. And it's an auspicious evening. It's October 7th. It is 2 years ago today that Hamas attacked Israel, killing over 1,200 people, taking 250 people as hostages. And according to what we know, there are supposedly still 48 hostages. I think many of them are already dead. The world has changed dramatically in the past 2 years, and so has attitude towards the state of Israel. And Hamas has been forgotten as being the contributor, and Iran certainly at the base of it. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just, I heard on the radio what that 12, I'm sorry, how many was it,
1,200 people.
1,200. If that were translated to
Right.
the population of the United States, that would be something in the neighborhood of 40,000.
Exactly.
So
Now,
what would we
that doesn't-
do if somebody came in and slaughtered 40,000 of our citizens?
Right. And look, what's going on in Gaza is tragic and unfortunate and horrible and lamentable, and Israel is not always right, and let me say that up front. But I think we also have to realize that all of the relief dollars that went into Gaza built hundreds and hundreds of miles of underground tunnels, and Hamas placed their control underneath hospitals, schools, and others, and it's just tragic. In any event, thank you for being here. It's my pleasure to be back this year. Maybe I'll even come next year if you would like me. But tonight, you have to be brave to deal with that, okay? It's in everybody's mind, whether they discuss it or they don't discuss it. It's a challenge to the modern world. And as Reverend Nate pointed out to me, the topics we're going to be discussing over the next month, this really is in some ways a conclusion of what's been going on over the past 250 years. The world has evolved enormously to the point where we would even consider this as a concept and a concern. And so we're really starting at the end, and we're going to go back to the beginning next week and kind of move ourselves through emancipation, enlightenment, the 18th, 19th century, and into the issues of ethnicity in the United States, which is disappearing. But tonight, we are faced with this kind of a question, and we're going to talk about how it becomes part of the dialogue of people's self-perceptions. Where do our ideas come from? What do we hold on to? And what maybe do we need to change? And for the reasons I will explain as we go through this tonight. So that's the question. And I have answers for you. It's an answer. And then probably the most normal answer, maybe. But as you look and perceive the question, you have to kind of ask, what's happened through the centuries about the ideas of God, and how have they evolved, or maybe they haven't, or where do they actually need to be brought into a modern perception of the life that you and I are living in? So if we look at kind of visual representations of artists' view of God, we see power, decision-making, and we also kind of think about globally what has been an understanding of God, independent of whether you're Christian or Jewish or Muslim? And we're going to look at those ideas as we progress this evening. But in monotheistic thought, God is usually viewed as a supreme being, the creator, the principal object. God is omnipotent, which means all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing. Just remember that song about Santa? He knows when you've been good or bad, okay? Conceived as being all of these things and omnibenevolent, as well as eternal and necessary existence. Now think in your own minds, where did these ideas evolve from? Hold the thought. In Judaism, which is an origin faith certainly for the Christian community, the God of Israel works in history, so that historical events are viewed as being the result of God's behavior and God's action. And in the images that we have from the Bible, we have the idea of God as king, God's presence, transcendent, God has emotions. And there's another view. So, God creates everything, God saves, God punishes, God speaks, true sovereign, disciplines nations, God disciplines rulers, God authorizes human government. Well, you can understand, perhaps, how these ideas came into being because they are projection of human beings' perception of God themselves. So there we have, it's not Trump and Heston, but it's this idea of the commandments coming down from God, and this is always a cute one. So the number God was supposed to have killed in the Bible, 2,559,449. Now, can you imagine the person who did that counting? Would you want them for your accountant? That's the next question. But that's what the Bible showed, and the Bible, which is something that we share closely, reflects a perception of God which has been handed down through the centuries. Not a happy-looking person, God or whatever, blowing those ears. I love the ears. Don't you love the ears?
Yes.
There we are again. Oh, this is a tough one. But these are human expressions of how they see and perceive the idea of God in history. So the Nicene Creed, which is familiar to you, is reflective of how Christianity frames an understanding of God. You know it because you say it, right? It's part of your worship service. Do you do it every?
Occasionally.
Occasionally. Well, we know that the crew that I work for
We do it all the time.
all the time. And it kind of like gets into your brain as to what it is. Now, a couple of years ago, I did a podcast on some of these ideas with a friend of mine who was an Episcopal priest. And the reason why I wanted to do it with him was not only that we had a long friendship, he was a professor at EDS, the Episcopal Divinity School in Boston, which is now out of business. They closed down. Divinity schools are not doing very well these days. But nonetheless, part of the reason why I wanted to have that conversation with him was because Christianity as a faith model has a very defined and very laid out perception of God. So the question that I was trying to raise with him and that I raised with you is, how do you modify that to have it fit with all of the advances in human awareness and growth that have taken place up to today? This is just a kind of reflection of the ideas of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, and how they intersect, and in some ways how they differ. You can't read the writing, but you get an idea of some of it. So Maimonides in the 12th century developed his principles of faith. Maimonides was a rabbi living in Spain, then moved to Egypt, very well known within Jewish circles as Maimonides. Some of you are familiar with Maimonides, some of the writings of his, the Guide to the Perplexed especially. But again, Judaism as a faith has always believed in the idea and existence of God, but the ideas about that God were never as firmly defined as the Christian community or the Muslim community. So Maimonides in the 12th century tried to create for what he believed would be a parallel to Christian understandings of God for the Jewish community. Now let me say that though he created it, and he was not alone, other Jewish thinkers that we're going to look at also created their own list of ideas, which kind of shows you that there is no supreme authority that would determine and establish which was the definitive. It would have to be, in a sense, for whatever community or whatever individual would assent to. So in Islam, Allah is the supreme being, conceived as the perfect and omnipotent and omniscient originator and ruler of the universe. Sound a little bit familiar? Okay? Just the words change. So these are the pillars of Islam, the 5 pillars: faith, prayer, fasting, almsgiving, and pilgrimage. You can't read all the writing, but those are, in essence, the core responsibilities of someone who is a believer in Islam. So, one of the things that I wanted to point out was the distinction between the Protestant community and the Catholic community in terms of some of its faith commitments. And what you can see here, if you could read it at all, is the distinction among Protestants on sola fide or sola scriptura, which have to do with the idea of faith or scripture and how they interact with each other in distinction to the Catholic perceptions of those ideas. Important or not important. I want to show some of the distinctions. So here's another Jewish thinker from the 14th century who created in his own ideas, which were the 3 pillars, the root concepts, principles of the idea of God. So there was a belief in the existence of God, a belief in the revelation of God, a belief in divine justice, as related to the idea of immortality. Now, I don't think there's a significant distinction between the way Christians believe about God or have been taught about God over the centuries to these principles of Alba. So he then broke it down into some of the subcategories. That the existence of God was unified, incorporeal, non-physical, timeless, perfection, prophecy, omniscient. They all could be easily transferred into your pews in the way in which God is represented. So another guy, Crescus, around the same time, is creating his own ideas. This is just to give you an idea of the diversity within the Jewish community and the fact that Judaism doesn't have a supreme authority that would determine what's in and what's out, as opposed to certainly what happened within the Catholic community over the course of the first centuries of the Council of Nicaea, where ideas were consolidated and ideas were dropped out. And then certainly with Martin Luther and the beginning of the Protestant Revolution, we had the same kind of ideas, changes that took place, and then the various groups that fall under the big umbrella of the Protestant concepts. Hundreds of variations, right? Good. So obligatory beliefs, We don't need to really look at that. Okay. This is a good one. So on February 26, 1616, Galileo was formally banned and banished by the Catholic Church for teaching and defending the opinion that the Earth orbits the Sun. Talk about power. Do we now believe that? Is that a heresy, that the Earth moves around the Sun? So here we are, 500 and something, or 400 and something years later, and we've changed. But think of the power of the 16th century to make decisions like that about what was real and what wasn't, what was acceptable and what wasn't. Religious conservatives claim Katrina was God's omen punishment for the United States. The Reverend Franklin Graham, you remember his daddy? Okay. This is one wicked city. It's known for Mardi Gras, for Satan's worship. It's known for sexual perversion. It's known for every type of drug and alcohol and the orgies and all of those things that go down in New Orleans. So now we know that there are people who still want to tag natural disasters to the behavior of the people who live there. You following me? Mm-hmm. He's not alone. How about this? 7 reasons why God allows earthquakes. Let me tell you something. I don't want a God like that. All right? I don't know about you, but I'm going to give you my bottom line. How about this? In the 50 years since the end of the Holocaust, theologians have tried to make sense of the terrible event. One explanation by the theological right wing of Judaism contends that the Holocaust was visited upon the Jewish people as a punishment for their sins. While there is no unanimity as to what the sin was, there is general agreement that ultimately God was the author of the Holocaust, just as he is the author of all history. If the Jewish people suffered greatly in the Holocaust, God must have had a good reason for inflicting this pain upon them. God's reason is often explained by a number of theologians as divine retribution. I don't want that God either. Okay? But you know that there are people who believe this, who believe that everything that happens is just God's will and that's just the way it is. So, a very, very right-wing group of Jews, way out there, the Neturei Karta. The Holocaust came as a punishment from God because of our sins. No army, no air force, and no state of Israel will help us from another Holocaust. It has nothing to do with material defense. Going against God will only bring another Holocaust. Offensive. But we don't own that idea uniquely. There are enough people within the Christian community and the Muslim community who believe exactly the same way about that as a perception of God's acting in the world. So, where do our beliefs actually come from? They come from our families. They come from our church schools, our synagogue schools, our prayer books. Now, you are a non-liturgical church. And let me explain that in case you don't know. There are, within religious communities, liturgical and non-liturgical communities. Liturgical communities, like the Catholic Church and like the Jewish community, have a prayer book. And it is structured and continuous. The Protestant community, except for the Episcopalians, doesn't have a book of common prayer. You have pamphlets that you get when you come into church on Sunday, and it tells you what hymns are going to be sung, what readings are going to be read, and it varies. It's something that you're familiar with, it's something that you're comfortable with. But to people who come from the other side, where they have a book that they work with, It's different. What's common to both of them is that each of these modalities provide certain ideas and concepts that are either right out there or they're subliminal. I always got a kick out of the way in which readings take place within churches on Sunday morning. Because there's always a reading from what is referred to politically as the Old Testament. I refer to it as the Hebrew Bible. And then there is a reading from the New Testament, which I refer to as the Christian Bible. But think of the placement of one to the other. There is a statement that is being made. One has superseded or replaced the one before it. You always want the new car as opposed to the old car, or the new improved toothpaste as opposed to the old toothpaste, which didn't have fluoride or whatever it was in it. But these are places that we learn about these things. In most cases, we learn them when we're very young. And then we don't really spend a whole lot of time thinking about them as we grow and mature. I always got a kick in the synagogue when you would meet kids who were going to be bar bat mitzvah when they're 13, and you'd say, well, what comes next? I'm done. I'm finished. And you'd say, wait a second. Are you dropping out of school too? Have you given up on any further learning? Because maybe your brain's a little better now when you're 13 than when you were 7. But the same thing in many cases is true of people within the Christian community. They don't really have continuous learning or education to evolve their ideas from when they were 7, 8, 9, 11. So when I was a synagogue rabbi in Rochester, I had a strong relationship with the Third Presbyterian Church, which had gone on for probably 70 years. And we would do classes together, but we would also do pulpit exchanges. And I would sit there on a Sunday morning before I would speak or get dialogue with John Wilkinson, who was their pastor, and I would look at the crowd and I'd say, you know what? These people are exactly the same as the people in my community. They're the same education level, they're the same basic income level, they live in similar kinds of houses. But what's different? How are they formed? How are they framed? Well, at Third Presbyterian, the children would come in and then leave for religious education, which was 45 minutes on a Sunday morning. The entire 7th grade curriculum was the 10 Commandments. I would have finished that off in a day, but it was the whole year. So I thought to myself, what does the 35-year-old, what does the 45-year-old, what does the 85-year-old sitting in this community know? Well, they have a strong commitment to their music, which is remarkable. They have a strong commitment to their kind of basic faith models, but beyond that, I don't know. I'm not sure they know if I was to challenge them and ask them what they know and where their heads are. But this has to do with our kind of investigation into ourselves as to where we've gotten to in our own faith understandings and how those affect us in the way in which we live, in the way in which we think, in the way in which we act. So, if God is all good and God is all powerful, why do terrible things happen? Well, you saw different aspects of the Christian community, the Jewish community say, it's all God. It's because you sinned. You're a sinner, and that's the end of it. Trying to reconcile these things is what we call theodicy, an attempt to understand why God allows evil to exist in the world. Belief in only one God makes Judaism and Christianity particularly vulnerable to the problem of theodicy. For there is no one else to blame for evil. The devil made me do it, won't work. For an all-powerful God could easily negate the devil's work. In a world created by a good God, where does evil originate? It's our challenge since we were little kids.
Rabbi, the best explanation I never heard or saw from that was Rabbi Kushner's book.
Well, there we go. Okay. Trust me. Trust me. So some of you have read this book, I think? Okay.
Yes.
I've met Rabbi Kushner when he was still alive. And you know his story, his background? He had a child who had a tragic genetic disease called progeria, rapid aging. And in the way in which he tried to interpret the experience of what he was going through with his son, who at 13 was like an 80-year-old, he came up with this challenge of why do bad things happen to good people. So part of what he addressed and came to was that there is a randomness in the world. That in reality, we just can't keep saying, this is what God wanted, and we have to accept it. I'm reminded of what I said to you earlier today about this challenge of how do we interpret the world around us and the experiences. So take a train wreck, a plane crash, whatever you want, a building collapsing. They always find one or two people who they interview. I got stuck in traffic, I missed the plane, thank God. Well, you know what? Does that mean everybody else on the plane were a bunch of idiots and sinners? I can't believe that. We don't really want to accept the idea that things happen randomly. Now, I believe that Rabbi Kushner was onto something very, very critical and important in our discussion tonight and in our own lives. But he was so engaged with the tragedy of his son's beliefs and experience that he never moved beyond that to try and create a new theology that made sense in the 20th and 21st century. What do I mean by that? Well, hold that thought and let's take a look here. I'm going to show you charts from Pew and Gallup, reputable sources. These are not from TikTok or Instagram, where most people get their information from today, tragically, which is one of the great problems why we're in the state we're in. So you can't really see it well, but what it's saying is, compared with older Americans, fewer young adults believe in an active, engaged God. I'm just now going to set the stage for what's taking place in our society and our culture, and we're going to talk about why and how. Relatively few religious nuns, you know, remember the nuns, those ladies in those black outfits? We're not talking about them anymore. We now have a whole category known as nuns. People who believe nothing. And in the latest result, they're actually more than half the country.
Talking this country.
This country, yes. Europe's gone. We should know that. Europe is over. As one of my friends said to me, in countries that don't even have a birth rate, what is there to even involve oneself with? Europe has no birth rate. They're on their way gone. They're full of lovely churches, but they're relics. They're empty. Okay. So, belief in God is described in the Bible. 80% of Christians, it says. Net belief in God, higher power, or spiritual force. In the Jewish community, 33%. Believe in God, higher power, or spiritual force among religious nuns, 53%. Declare declining share of Americans express absolute certainty in their belief about God. And these are a host of different... It's not working, okay. Let's look at Protestants. It says 84% are absolutely certain in their belief in God. That's 2007. In 2014, and remember it's 2025, it was down to 74%. Net change in share of U.S. adults by stated religious affiliation. The unaffiliated have grown by over 15%.